Phineas was finally free of the Dravian and almond soldiers that had been blocking his path, as the Dravian mages felled a group of almonds. The common almond foot soldier gave the group room and he walked through that space, maintaining his invisibility. He scanned the battlefield for the royal guard Marcus. Unable to see the white and gold armor, his eyes were instead drawn to the body of a beast. A Dravian mage dressed in purple stood at the creature's neck. That's when he saw the white gauntlet, dagger in hand as it dipped and dropped. He saw the mage touch her side, and his invisibility wore off as he summoned a blast of wind that lifted her up and over the royal guard. She spun across the creature's body, landing on the opposite side of it. He walked forward, unsure of what she would do next. He looked at Marcus, hoping the guard was still alive. The little mage stood, unsure of what had happened. Then she locked eyes with Phineas. He pulled a ball of fire between his hands with a word and a pinch of sulfur. He heaved it at her. She reached out with her left hand as if she would catch it. It lit her hand ablaze, and she screamed. An orb of wind shifted around it, and the blaze was snuffed out. Phineas was shocked. He had never seen a magic spell spontaneously wink into existence like that. She looked at him. Anger smoldered in her eyes behind the purple veil. She swayed her hands, and a ball of electricity formed. He saw the electricity form and began his own spell. She swayed again, and the ball flew from her middle and index finger as she aimed it at him. He threw his own electricity spell at her, and the spells collided, then sputtered into nothingness. The principle was relatively simple. Two opposing forces of the same or opposite elements would cancel each other out. It was a basic wizard defense against all forms of magic. Well, as long as you knew what elements the spell dealt with. The Dravian mage didn't seem to know that. Her eyes had gone wide under the veil as she stood rigid. Phineas pulled another pinch of sulfur out of the pouch at his waist. He flung it forward as he willed another ball of fire at the young woman. She dived out of the way this time, behind the beast's body. The flames raced across it harmlessly. This wasn't a wizard's tool. He wasn't even sure he could call her a mage. He was probably 6 years older than her when he first traveled to Riva Moat, the Mage's Academy, an independent city-state at the northernmost point on the continent. He left the academy, following his master, only 10 short years later. He was surprised that this pup of a mage knew as much as she did, but then, her magic seemed different from the learned magic of the hallowed halls of Riva. He rolled some salt crystals around in his hand as he waited for her to pop back up. She poked her head up, looking at him over the creature's massive thigh. He couldn't help but laugh at the absurdness as he held his hand up and spoke the words. The salt crystals flew off his hand and formed a column of wind like a battering ram. It hit her in the sternum, sending her flying backward again. She screamed and cursed in a language he didn't know as she rolled on the ground, clutching her chest. He watched her warily as he walked around the creature to face her. It was a shame to have to kill her. There was so much he wanted to learn, but it wouldn't be prudent to leave her alive. He pulled a tiny vial of water from his pouches. He aimed it at her as he spoke the spell. The vial broke and 4 little water droplets lifted above his hand. They froze and formed 2-inch-long needles. They flew at the young mage. She screamed as she lifted her hand. A dribble of flame lashed out and the needles disappeared into a puff of steam. She pulled herself onto her knees, and Phineas tried to hit her with another bolt of wind. A shield of light sprang up between them. The column of wind hit it and spread out round it harmlessly. A cacophony of noise sprouted from behind Phineas. An unnatural, unearthly howl echoed out behind him. It sounded like 1,000 swords had been swallowed by a tornado. Then 100 quieter howls joined it from across the battlefield. A shiver ran down his spine as the atmosphere of the midday field turned. Every combatant felt like the eyes of a predator watched them. Solomon watched the Dravian mages as he marched forward with his guard. They had not moved since they had ringed the one in the red robes, and had set up some kind of shield wall. 3 of the colorfully robed mages kneeled on their left knees. A 4th stood above the center one, holding her shoulders. A large shield of light stretched the length of the mages. It was an odd red color, obscuring what lay behind it in silhouettes that moved. It reminded him of a Kari peep show. His guard walked up to the wall, almost questioningly. They timidly knocked on it with their weapons. He sighed and ordered them to walk around it as he walked towards the wall himself. He pulled his short sword into his hand and aimed it at the standing center mage's face. He lifted it back to swing, and the mage pulled her kneeling friend back, breaking the magical wall. The wall's fall revealed the rest of the mages. Dancing, directly opposite of him stood the mage in red. They seemed to be leading the group in some sort of ritual, but their motions ran opposite, quick jerking hand motions compared to the fluid dances of the other witches. 4 armored Dravians stood at the front, as the mages of the impromptu shield wall rolled back. They stood threatening with stolen short spears, not looking to score a hit, just hoping to make an almond think twice. The mages of the shield wall fired off magic as they rolled behind the guards. The various magics bounced off Solomon's royal guards. He had spent almost his entire force of magic wielders on the temporary enchantments, and he suddenly felt vindicated in the decision as a bolt of lightning skidded off his armor. He pulled his shield high, preparing to charge when the Dravian mage had stopped dancing. The mage and Red's hands met, their fingers moving quickly in a series of dizzying motions. Something about the motions brought a memory to Solomon. The tattoo on his hip burned in recognition. He heard a name whispered in his ear, Cathalion. Something about the name was visceral to his subconscious, and a flood of terror ran over him. The mage in red finished the hand motions, and the red ropes lit up like a bonfire as the witch spontaneously combusted. A creature emerged from the sands of Dravia, pulling itself through a magical circle on the ground with long clawed paws. It looked like a mutated sandwolf. The name Cathalion rang in his head again, and he suddenly remembered the real name for the creatures known as sandwolves, the spawn of Cathalion. It stood easily twice the size of a sandwolf. Instead of the normal gray mane, it was a vibrant yellow. Stripes in the same shade ran across its dark gray skin. Thorn-like spines ran up and down it. 2 swept-back horns jutted out from in front of its ears. The normally fleshy nose was peeled back, red, bloody, and skeletal. It thrashed as if it was bound in chains, shaking and pulling. The mages still stood around it in a circle and moving, their eyes closed. It continued to struggle until one of its 8 beady eyes caught Solomon in its vision. It twisted to face him, taking him in with all of its eyes. It seemed to chortle a piping metal sound, and then it went rigid. It ran at him. He prepared to block it as Valerie grabbed him and yanked him back. It jumped over the top of both of them. Now standing in the middle of his guards, it let out a heart-stopping howl, like the sound of 1,000 swords being bashed into each other. Howls greeted it in an all-too-eager choir. Solomon looked back to the mages as they fell to the ground exhausted, except for one. He stood there at the center of the mages, badly burned, disfigured, and naked. The Ender, Wolf, his tattoos flashing between an orangish red and a cold black. Wolf hoped the thing could be slain. Cathalion shouldn't be walking among the denizens of the material plane. It was one of the lesser primes of... He didn't know what he was thinking. Words rushed through his head. He questioned which were actually his own. He watched the thing, Cathalion, tear into the royal guard. It seemed to be watching Solomon as it did so. It kept a healthy distance away from the Ender as it ripped his guard apart. Solomon didn't watch the beast. His eyes were locked onto Wolf. Wolf said to no one in particular in a serious tone, "Get the tired witches out of here. Run for your lives." The guards that were left standing and the witches that shielded him rushed to obey his command. Or perhaps they rushed to save their own lives. Wolf wished them the best of luck, but he was unsure how they could make it. Sandwolves, Cathalion spawn, ran to and fro, slaying indiscriminately as they went. Cathalion's orders were clear. Kill everything. Eat later. The 2 Enders eyed each other through the chaos. Wolf waited to see what Solomon would do. His lone personal guard pulled at him, trying to get the king to return to camp. Wolf finally let the voices take him, and he released the chains from his skin. They fell with a sickly thump. He wrapped a link coming from his wrist around both his hands. The middle of the chains looked a deeper red. Steam ran off them as he ran at Solomon, raising his right arm. Solomon pushed his guard to the side as he raised his shield. Wolf slapped his shield with the chain in his raised arm, then he slipped to the left side of it. He punched the king in the face with his left fist. The king's helm tinged and Wolf's knuckles came back bloody. Solomon stumbled back from the impact. His guard stepped forward and smacked Wolf bodily with the large tower shield she wielded. He fell backward. The blow knocked him flat and the air out of him. He rolled to his feet sloppily, trying not to burn off one of his limbs. Solomon regained his composure and launched himself at Wolf. Wolf watched the guard pull her spear off her back as he slapped the chains at Solomon, trying to keep him at a distance. Something caught his attention, the blonde girl, as Solomon closed in on him. He barely dodged a short sword thrust, and he riposted by kicking Solomon's knee with all his force. A dreadful pop sounded, and Solomon grunted in dissatisfaction. Wolf had used that move in the fighting pits to shatter opponents' kneecaps, but the thick metal armor must have absorbed the mass of the impact. Or maybe it was the fact that he no longer had shoes on. Wolf used the opportunity to back away from Solomon, and his guard closed in, spearing at him. Wolf dodged into the spear and slashed out with his left arm. The chain sailed through the air, cutting the spear in half. It traveled through the guard's helm, blinding her. She didn't scream. She lashed out again with the broken spear. Wolf smacked it aside as he wrapped the length of the chain up his right arm. He had to jump to hit her in the chest, where her heart was, where it had been. He pulled his hand back and Solomon screamed. He hobbled at Wolf, swinging wildly. Wolf shook the chain on his right arm loose and lifted it to, once again, swing at the king and enter. Lalander held the shield spell up as a column of wind hit it, and a second later, a horrendous howl rang out, followed by the sounds of hundreds of smaller howls. The two casters' eyes never left each other as a stampede of heavy footfalls landed around them. Sandwolves rushed past the duo as they contemplated their next moves. Lalander's left hand stung furiously from the burn she had sustained earlier. One of the first spells a young witch was taught was how to summon a ball of fire, and it was a common game among them to toss that spell to one another. How she felt to catch this almond mage's shocked her and bruised her pride along with burning her hand. The way he had managed to snuff out her lightning spell, maybe almond mages were masters of the elements after all. She watched the black robes carefully as she clung onto the shield spell, her strength waning. The almond mage pulled something from a pouch on his hip, and a column of flame roared to life in the mage's palm. He aimed it at her and screamed into the shield. The heat was intense, and the flames licked at her shoulders as they ran around the construct of light. She gritted her teeth to avoid screaming in pain. The spell faded, and she was once again face to face with the almond through the shield. He prepared the spell again. Panic ran through her, then a deathly calm as an idea came to her. She let the shield fade as she stood. She swayed her hip. Her feet moved in an elegant circle as she twisted her hands. The mage aimed the cone of fire again, and she screamed her defiance back at it. She couldn't summon ice like the almond mage could, but she could try another one of his tricks. A whirlpool of flames leapt from her hands, mingling with the mage's. The two spells circled each other, roiling and boiling on the sand until they merged into something wholly unfamiliar. A globe of fire akin to the sun spun in place. Then it wobbled and slowly tottered towards the almond mage. He screamed and hurled a mote of wind at it. It wobbled again, then winked out of existence. He looked at her incredulously. She did her best to feign strength. She saw him pull something from his pouch again, and a large javelin of clay formed over his palm. He moved to throw it at her. She tried to imitate him again as she swayed, pulling a cluster of sand in front of her. She tried to form it like he had, but it resisted her. Instead, it spun faster and faster in a circle in front of her as she tried to shape it. The javelin flew at her. As its tip touched the circle of flying sand, it stopped dead. It trembled in place, and she willed the sand forward, hoping to fling it back at the mage. It once again resisted, this time against the mage's will. The javelin broke apart, joining into the circle of sand as the circle spun out of her control. It morphed and twisted, ripping the sand underneath it into itself. The more sand it swallowed, the faster it spun, until suddenly, with a whoosh, it exploded. Lalander covered her face as a rush of wind and sand shock-waved out from it. She was knocked from her feet, backward at first, then she was picked up and tossed forward. She landed hard on something, and all her strength left her. She blinked and tried to look around. When the clashing spells dissipated, they tossed motes of wind around the battlefield. A torrent of sand and dust devils now flitted across it. She tried to stand, but whatever she had landed on slipped out from underneath her, and she fell. She looked back at what she had been on and realized it was the sandwich she had helped slay earlier. The Almond Royal Guard still sat at the front of it, and now she lay on the ground at his outstretched legs. She pulled herself over to him in a crawl, her strength quickly sapping away. She had used too much magic, and her consciousness was fading. Sand swirled around her as she tried to prop herself up. Her arms gave out, and she slumped face first into the sand next to the guard as her eyes closed. Phineas blinked through tear-stained, irritated eyes as a mild sandstorm slipped around him. He had no idea where the young mage had gone off to. He had no idea where he was now. The chaotic mixing of spells had sent him flying. What was that young mage thinking? Trying to brute force a counterspell like that. She's lucky if she's still alive. Shadows moved around him, silhouettes in the sandy walls. He was nearly out of prepared spells. He had maybe a few attack spells left, and a few that were for his survival. He supposed abandoning his research wasn't a terrible idea if it meant keeping his life. Besides, he might have found a new research topic to study here in the desert of Dravia. He readied himself to cast a spell he rarely used, but always had prepared, as he pulled a feather and a few salt crystals from a pouch. He said the words, and he zipped through the sandy fog into the sky. He didn't look back as he departed, The time allowance on the spell didn't let him, and he doubted he would have anyway. Solomon thrust a short sword at Wolf. Wolf jumped backward and snapped the chain at him. Solomon deftly parried it with the shield as he sliced in a downward arc with the sword. Wolf bounced it away with a link wrapped around his left arm. Solomon screamed in frustration. Wolf said nothing, a scowl on what was left of his face. A number of Cathalion's spawn formed a circle around the Enders. Solomon knew it was over. For him, anyway. Whether Alma went on to conquer Dravia after this was no longer up to him. As soon as he saw Wolf standing there, he knew it. The tattoos on the Dravian Ender glowed bright orange and pulsed a sickly red as they slithered across his body. Solomon's only hope now was that he could kill the Ender before the inevitable happened. Even then, it wasn't a guarantee. There were stories of Enders exploding in their death throes. Solomon swung the short orange glowing sword in a horizontal arc. Wolf jumped back away from it again. Solomon pushed forward with his shield. Wolf jumped to Solomon's right and tried to punch him, but Solomon swung the sword up and Wolf's left arm tumbled away. The chain disappeared and the tattoos went cold on it as the arm just above the elbow separated from his body. He didn't scream. He did punch with his right arm, forcing Solomon to lift the shield to defend himself. Solomon thrust forward with his short sword, but Wolf didn't dodge it. It pierced him through the center of his body, and he stepped forward into it. The sword burned through him easily, and soon Solomon's forearm was inside the wound. He tried to pull back away from Wolf, but the Ender grabbed him under his shield arm and pulled him close. Solomon let go of his weapons as he kicked and punched, trying to force him to let go. Wolf's eyes were glazed over as if he were dead already. He looked Solomon in the eyes, and some kind of light returned to them, and his tattoos shifted, changing from links of chains to links of thorny vines as he said, "I remember you. I remember everything." The sickly red of the pulsing now permanently covered the length of the thorny vines. Their brightness blinded Solomon. Then everything was black. Where was he again? Who was he? Lilandra awoke to a rumble. She tried to open her eyes, but they wouldn't budge. She felt a searing heat and an intense pressure on her back. She felt sick as she was tossed, spinning uncontrollably. She tried to brace herself, but her body wouldn't respond. She crashed into something, and then something heavy smashed into her back. She became entangled with the objects as she spun. Something hard and sharp pressed into her cheek, tearing it open. She felt the blood trickle down her face as she came to a rest. She once again tried to open her eyes, to move, but it was no use. She didn't have the strength yet to do either. She felt herself drift out of consciousness again, and she fell into a deep sleep. She woke up much later. The sun had begun to set, and the chill had awoken her. She tried to stand, and found that she was pinned to the ground by something heavy. She felt the sensation of cold metal underneath her as she looked down. The Almond Royal Guard lay there, unmoving. She shimmied and squirmed, freeing herself from under the body of the sandwolf. She looked at the guard and the grotesquerie, tangled up together in a lump. She decided to at least pull his helmet off to see if he was still alive, and was shocked to see his eyes were staring unblinkingly ahead. A pang of guilt ran through her as she remembered the venom that paralyzed him, and she began to cast a spell to heal the affliction. As the spell was completed, he began to sob quietly. He turned his head looking behind Lilandra. She followed his gaze and realized how quiet it was. A few bodies lay about, lots of dead sandwolves, but what struck her the most was the crater in the sand. A mirror of melted sand reflected the sun, dimmed by the streams of fine particles already filling it in. There was a smell to the air, not blood, nor burning bodies, but an ozone smell. No armies held the field. Almond and Dravian camps alike were being torn down. Some field medics and mages braved the field looking for survivors. No one seemed interested in retrieving what remained of the dead. Almond soldiers milled about their camp, unsure of what to do. Dravians broke down their camps and scattered into the desert to return to their clans. She looked to the Almond soldier again. "What do you want to do? We can't stay here long," she said. Caled sat next to Leah in the witch's covered canvas wagon as he picked through Wolf's journal. If it held a secret to open the lockbox he had given him and Leah, Caled was unsure of where it was. He scrawled through the pages, which, at first, were organized thoughts directly from the living god's head. They quickly turned into disjointed recollections. Sometimes the pages were in a different language entirely, or the writing was smeared and so archaic that Caled had a hard time deciphering them. He had turned to Leah many times during the travel so far, trying to discuss his findings or lack thereof, but she shushed him in an effort to maintain the illusion of their shared vow of silence. They had heard sandwoods out in the distance multiple times, and the caravan of covered wagons seemed to be marching along as quickly as it could. The air in the wagon hung thick with dirt, palpable tension and silence. He turned once again to Leah, the journal in his hand. She had had no interest in looking at the book, and the times he had tried to hand it to her, she had gently pushed it back to him, so this time he didn't bother to try. Before he could say anything, she raised her hand to silently shush him again, but before she could, a roaring sound echoed out from behind the wagon. A rush of hot air rocked the wagon, and then, with a whoosh, it brought a torrent of sand that assailed the caravan. Then, silence. All the eyes in the wagon looked behind them, towards the long-departed battlefield. No one there could see it from this distance. No one there could see past the camels that led the wagon behind them, but they all looked. No one wanted to break the silence that had torn the old one asunder. Caleb bound the journal the way that Wolf had before he had handed it to him. He no longer wanted to think about what the future held for him. He no longer wanted to talk to Leah about the book. He wanted to close his eyes and forget everything for a moment. As he tied the last binding on the book, he noticed a strange shine from inside the book's spine. He carefully put the book in his lap and pressed the cover hard as he slid his index finger into the spine. He felt the shape of a key tucked into a small pocket. Then he finished binding it. Even after finding the key, his thoughts had not changed. The idea of opening the box now made him a little queasy. He slid the journal into his borrowed witch's robes above his heart as he slumped under the wagon's bench. He closed his eyes as he tried not to think about the last 15 years of his life, or what next week might bring. Cathelian watched the caravans of wagons departing the battlefield campsites from a jutting, rocky outcrop he lounged on leagues away from the chaos. He had lost scores of his spawn to the explosion, and he knew that would be the cost, but he couldn't pass up on evening the score with the champion of light, Shield. It may have been thousands of years since they had last met, but he wasn't one to forget, especially a disfigurement. He tried to wrinkle his nose, and a stinging, searing pain greeted him back. His eyes narrowed on the crater left behind by the champion of dark, thorns, death throes. His pain felt a little eased. He didn't know why Thorn had reached out to him. All their pacts had long concluded, but it was an opportunity he couldn't resist. Unlike a normally summoned creature, he did not risk true death from being here in the material plane. None of the primes feared death, lesser or greater. He breathed in a deep, long breath through his mouth, filling his massive lungs with the cool air of the desert. He would have to adapt to the coolness of this world if he wanted to leave this sand-filled place. It had been far too long, thousands and thousands of years since he had walked the Airdom's fertile lands, and he wanted to see the ways in which it had changed. He stood and shook the sand from his body. He would have to prepare for the night chill. It would take time before his skin would thicken enough to withstand the cold. He took a second to gaze over the ruin-filled bodies and the hurried camps that were packing up. Then he set his eyes on one of the covered wagons of the desert dwellers, and he began tracking it in a slow gallop. He left his spawn behind. They would only slow him down. He loved them, but in a distant, cold way, like one would love the tip of their fingernail or a single strand of hair. Given enough time, he could always make more. A smile spread across his face. He was going to enjoy his time here,